I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. If we could all take a moment of silence for the loss of our member, 19-year member, Barbara. Thank you very much. Our prayers and concerns are with the students, their families, and the staff after this tragic shooting, and we mourn the loss of our member. I have long dreaded the day that St. Louis would join the list of communities ravaged by school-based violence. And while our schools have managed to remain mostly safe places until now, the reality is that the streets and communities of St. Louis have been plagued by senseless gun fatalities for too long. Our state has some of the weakest gun laws in the country, and today's tragedy is a reminder that we must do far more to protect all Missourians and make our schools and neighborhoods safe and welcoming. I'd like to turn over our forum now to our building steward at Adams Elementary. He's also the preschool teacher over there, and everybody knows him from being on Channel 9 doing his lessons during the pandemic. Let's welcome Dr. Albert Sanders.
Thank you all very much. Glad to be here. Glad we can still try to host this meeting on such a tragic day. But I'm Albert Sanders, like Ray said, President Cummings said. I work at Adams Elementary, and I'm a pre-K teacher, and I love what I do. On behalf of Local 420 and Adams Elementary, I would like to welcome you to our public forum on tax increment financing, commonly known as TIFs and tax abatements this evening. Our goal is to demystify how they can affect school revenue in Missouri generally and for SLPS specifically. We have some elected officials in our audience here at the office, at the Local 420 office. And we also have some that are joining us online. So first of all, we'd like to welcome all in our ones in the office. We have Senator Beck. And we also have Alderwoman Alderwoman Tina Sweet Tea Peel of now the 17th Ward, but soon to be the 9th Ward. And she will give you some welcome remarks. And I give you Sweet Tea Peel.
Great, thank you, everyone. I appreciate being here. I would also like to bring forth condolences for the tragedy that happened today. It is a very, very sad event here in St. Louis and in the nation. And I appreciate everything that the American Federation of Teachers, Local 420, has been doing for the schools and will continue to do for the schools. It's important for our children. It's important for our children because our children want to learn. Our children want to be educated. We know how much our children just sap up the knowledge and they become alive when they learn and get new knowledge. And so thank you, American Federation of Teachers, Local 420. So today we're going to be talking about tax incentives, and it is something that we all must look at in order to help our city thrive and survive. You know, in terms of tax incentives, we look at them right now, we're going to look at them with a close eye because we want to improve our tax base. And one way we can improve our tax base is through growth and development, economic development and equitable development. And what I see is that as we look at this, we want to improve and bring more revenues to the schools and also to other city services like streets and refuse, and they're all impacted by this. And I champion accountability. And that's what this is also about, is making ourselves as a city, as alder people, as officials, as taxpayers, accountable to each other. I welcome Greg Leroy from Good Jobs First. He's been doing this work for over 30 plus years. And I thank him for being here, and that the American Federation of Teachers, Local 420, has brought in this national speaker. Thank you.
Next, we're gonna be updated on just what the local 420's educational about 420's educational summits from a person who really needs no introduction. An educator recently referred to as one of the top 100 people shaping the region in the area of education by St. Louis Magazine for his push to implement full service schools. My president, Ray Cummings, the president of Local 420.
Thank you, Albert. Good evening. My name is Ray Cummings, and I currently serve as the president of Local 420. First, I'd like to give a special shout out to Alderman Tina Sweet Tea Peel for her support of the St. Louis Public Schools and the community in general in all of her conversations, unlike some of her other colleagues. Let's give her a round of applause. Since 1935, Local 420 has served the St. Louis Public Schools and the city of St. Louis. Local 420 is the exclusive representative of the greatest number of St. Louis Public Schools employees. We were one of the first racially integrated labor unions in the United States. In addition, as an organization, we were racially integrated before the St. Louis Public Schools, something we are very proud of. Local 420 believes in democracy. All of our officials are elected by our members. Make no mistake about it, Local 420 supports elected school boards, and we believe in elected officials governing our community because they can be held accountable by the voters at the ballot box, unlike appointed pencil-pushing bureaucrats. However, even those appointed bureaucrats' actions can eventually be held accountable by the voters. Approval or rejection of those elected officials who appointed those bureaucrats in the first place. Tonight's program is part of what we call Local 420's Education Summit Series. These summits are designed to bring together various stakeholders in our community in an effort to have the type of conversations which ultimately lead to improved educational opportunities for all our children. I would like to share the origin of our Education Summit #1, which we are immersed in right at this time, and what I consider some of its accomplishments. Dr. Adams, on December the 1st of 2020, presented at the Board of Education working session. In part, he made two observations. One, we, the St. Louis Public Schools, operate downstream from political forces that have divested themselves from our neighborhoods and our children. I believe Dr. Adams was correct, and I have to salute him for having the courage to point that out. Number two, he's political and financial investments beyond what the district can afford on its own. At the time, I thought about the statement and came to the conclusion that he perhaps did not fully understand that the Board of Education itself was a part of the political forces he referred to. After all, the Board of Education is an elected body composed of members elected by the voters to work with all other elected officials to do what is in the best interest of our citizens and the city of St. Louis, up to and including how to influence investments in our neighborhood and advocating for affordable housing for our families in the city. I recognize the need to bring together elected officials from the city and members of the Board of Education to discuss education-related issues. In less than a month, I convened Local 420's first Education Summit. This meeting was attended by the then Board of Aldermen President, the Controller, Board of Education President Dorothy Brody Collins, Board of Education Vice President Susan Jones, and the President of the St. Louis Labor Council, Pat White. Some may wonder why I included the President of the Labor Council. To them, I say St. Louis is a union town, and organized labor needs to be at the table, especially when we're discussing something as important as education. As a result of that first meeting during the month of January of 2021, Local 420 continued to meet with small groups of various stakeholders, local politicians, and various alderpersons advocating for the following. Number one, implement a moratorium on the opening of new schools in the city of St. Louis until a unified citywide plan was developed, especially since the population of the city of St. Louis and the enrollment of the St. Louis public schools were both declining, and the Board of Education had recently voted to close several schools. It just no longer made sense to continue to open schools in some willy-nilly fashion, and enrollment barely supports our present numbers of schools, especially given the lack of adequate resources and precious resources at this time. Number two, to develop a coordinated plan that will ensure that any TIF and tax abatement past or present contribute their fair share of revenue to the St. Louis Public Schools. And number three, to commit to develop a citywide plan for schools located in the city of St. Louis in collaboration with the St. Louis Public School Board of Education. In less than a month, the Board of Education unanimously adopted a resolution supporting a moratorium on all new school openings, so the citywide plan was developed. In consultation with the Board of Education, the Missouri State School Board Association also adopted a similar resolution. Following the adoption of these resolutions, Local 420 and the Board of Education worked collectively to get the Board of Aldermen to adopt its own resolution in favor of the moratorium until a unified plan was developed. Alderman Jesse Todd, a member of Local 420's retiree chapter, introduced Resolution 65 in July of 2021. The vote was one short of being unanimous. That's one hell of an accomplishment to get that many politicians to agree about anything. Fast forward, and now there are serious discussions about the St. Louis Public Schools not being harmed financially by TIFs and tax abatement in all quarters. And even some talk about legislation at the state level to make sure that St. Louis Public School gets its fair share of tax revenue. Also, the Board of Education is in the process of developing a citywide plan. Presently, the board has reached out to all stakeholders, including charter schools religious, and even parents of homeschool students to be a part of the citywide plan development process. Let me be clear, Local 420 is not resting on its laurels. I'm proud to report that 420 has begun to roll out its Education Summit Series 2, designed to investigate and help solve perhaps the greatest danger to public education today, a shortage of qualified educators. We have included some information. We will be sending out some information shortly. Be sure to sign up to be a part of this important summit. In closing, I want to thank Alderwoman Peel and all of our community host partners for their participation in making this forum a success. The Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, New Community PAC, the Ecumenical Leadership Council, and the Missouri Progressive Action Group. Also, I want to personally thank each and every one of you for attending. I hope and pray this evening will be an enlightening experience for all of you. Thank you very much.
It gives me great pleasure at this time to introduce tonight's guest speaker. He is the leading watchdog of state and local economic development subsidies and an encyclopedia of information regarding subsidies. He founded and directs Good Jobs First, a research and policy center promoting accountability and economic development. I present to you Mr. Greg Leroy, the Executive Director of Good Jobs First. Let's welcome Greg with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. President Cummings, Senator Beck, Alderwoman Peel, members and leadership of AFT Local 420. Thank you very much for this invitation to be here today. Again, I direct a nonprofit research group called Good Jobs First. We're based in Washington, D.C. I've been aware of the issues I'm going to talk about here in Missouri for a very long time, more than 20 years. I wrote a section of a book chapter about the situation on TIF in Missouri 18 or 19 years ago. So it's a little bit deja vu all over again, but I think it's exciting that so many people are tuned in right now to this issue and the chance to really fix things. So I'm going to share my screen and lay out some of the facts. Everybody see my screen, I hope? Looks good. All right, thank you. So let's talk about what's supposed to be happening with this money. All right, is it okay? Can't see my screen. All right, says I'm sharing, but we'll work with the AV people here to see if we can. Up now, terrific. Okay, great. Accept definition of incentive is on the screen. Okay, great, super, thank you. So here's the college textbook definition of what this money is supposed to be doing, right? It's a taxpayer investment. This is public money, right? And it's for something that should happen. It's something that's good, that should happen, but it isn't happening, and it will not happen until public dollars reduce private risk. That's what's supposed to be happening here. We're supposed to be rewarding companies that are taking chances and putting their own skin in the game too, to help revitalize the city, right? That's the purpose of incentives like TIF and tax abatements. So keep that definition in mind as we talk about what's really going on here in Missouri. So incentives come in many different flavors and stripes. Kenny Thomas, Professor Emeritus for UMSL. Kenneth Thomas is also with us here in the room, and we rely on his research from 2 books that he wrote on this issue to teach us that among the biggest cost items here, we think it's at least $70 billion a year, probably more now. That's a figure we put together a few years ago, state and local total spending for this program. We're going to talk specifically about those first 2 bullets tonight because they are the big dogs, the big dollar issues here in St. Louis. Property tax abatements, which is to say exemptions or deep discounts in property taxes, and TIF districts, which divert property and other kinds of taxes. First of all, let's talk about where your school revenue comes from, because that's really important, okay? The chart on the right shows you that in the typical school district in America today, less than half the revenue comes from local sources. Only about 48% comes from local sources. And the biggest chunk of that pie, almost a third, is property taxes. That's your typical revenue mix in America today. But if you look over at Missouri, just statewide, it's not that way anymore. Really, it's only about 40% local sources. And I'm sorry, it's much more than that. 60% local sources and a smaller share of state money and a little bit more in federal. But the big point here is statewide Missouri schools are more dependent than average on local sources, especially the property tax. Then let's look at St. Louis specifically, and this is from their own annual report, and I apologize for the small type because it's their own chart that I copied out of their financial report. The big blue chunk that looks like the Pac-Man there on the left, that's local sources, and it's 76% of the revenue pie. So instead of the national average of 48% or the statewide average of 60%, here in St. Louis, local sources are more than 3/4 of all the dollars supporting schools come from your local property and sales taxes, essentially. Federal is much bigger than the state's share. Federal is 14 and state is 9. So the state's really doing very little for St. Louis schools compared to the big picture, either nationally or statewide. Also important to keep in mind as we talk about TIF and abatements. And then here's where the city gets its revenue from, the city general fund. Again, the earnings tax, which is the unusual payroll tax, right? That's all dedicated to the local general fund. That's 36%. That's the big red piece of the pie there. Property tax 14, sales tax 9, and so on. But again, big dependence on local, completely local sources, many of which get affected by abatements, as I'll show you in a minute. I apologize again, this is a slide from a group called Still Unequal. I really tip my hat to them. They've done a great job explaining the inequities in the school finance system in your state. The big picture here is this. If you look at the middle column there, the ones with the orange and red slices, that's a measure of poverty, right? And as you go further down, you get schools that are more populated by students who come from low-income families and therefore qualify for free or discounted lunch prices, right? So as you go down to the bottom there, to Rockwood, Riverview Gardens, and Ferguson, for example, 100% of the students there are eligible for free or reduced price lunches. And then the left series of pie charts is race, and the Black population is the turquoise color. So you can see also as the student population becomes more children of color, it's also more likely to be eligible for free lunches, which we all know is the racialized nature of poverty in America. No surprises here. But then you look at the bar charts on the right, and bingo, the poorer or blacker or browner a school becomes, the less well-funded it is at the end of the day when you talk about mixing property tax, state revenue, and federal aid to the schools. St. Louis is the third line there. It spends a little more than average, and that's frankly because of the advocacy and merits of the system here, people that are on the phone tonight watching this, but we know the system is very unequal. So let's talk about what TIF works. I'm going to show you a graphic in a minute, but I want to explain it orally first because it's really simple. The idea is you take a small area, usually a few blocks or even just a block or a few, and usually a developer or a company proposes to redevelop the TIF. They say, we're going to bring new life to this area. We're going to build some new things. We're going to fix some things up. We're going to clean it up, whatever. And therefore, the property values will go up as a result of this redevelopment activity. And therefore, the property tax assessments and the property taxes are going to go up after that happens too, right? As it should, right? When that happens, when the redevelopment happens, we're going to split the property tax flow and other taxes in your case, but especially the property tax. We're going to split them into two streams. The first stream tied to the old value, the so-called base value before the redevelopment, that will continue to go where it always went. Schools, general fund, police, fire, sanitation, public, justice, all that stuff. But all the increase, which we call the tax increment, that's where the name of this subsidy comes from, all the increase for, in your case, 23 years, will not go to public services. It will go instead to subsidize that redevelopment activity in that little geographic area. and it can build infrastructure, it can parcel land, it can pay for soft costs, it can remediate contaminated property, it can do lots of things. It's a very flexible subsidy, and that's another reason why public officials like it so much. But 23 years of nothing supporting public services, that's the point here. So you have to be careful with it because you're committing a lot of money for a long period of time. And there's some glitches with the theory behind the way it works. That's the theoretical model I just laid out, all right? So here's the theory as a graphic, and I tip my hat to Molly Metzger and the Team TIF project for this project. It does a good job explaining it, right? So that inclined line is the theoretical increase in property values over time, thanks to the redevelopment. The base value is the purple at the bottom. That's the flow. That's the previous old value before redevelopment that keeps going to the general fund and schools and so on. But all the increment goes, all the yellow gets diverted for 23 years. And then theoretically, at the end of the TIF, we're in the gold. We've hit the gold pot there at the end of the rainbow. Everybody's supposed to be happy because now the whole thing is back on the tax rolls and we've got a revitalized tax base that's richer than it was before. All right, kumbaya, and everybody's happy. That's the Wizard of Oz version of TIF. Let's talk about how many things get diverted here by TIF. So the school loses the first two bullets there. It loses property and sales tax revenues. The city loses 6 kinds of revenue that get diverted into TIF, right? All the earnings, the incremental, that is the share of the new increased share of it, gross receipts, utility, and hotel as well. So it's a lot of different revenue streams because we saw in that pie chart, the earnings tax, for example, is by far the biggest single source of revenue for the city. And it's one of the things that gets captured by your TIF districts, away just harming the city by itself. Property tax abatements basically freeze the value of the property, the assessed value, the tax value of the property at the level before the redevelopment activity, and then gives the developer or the company 100% exemption on the increase in the value for up to 10 years, and perhaps half again more for another 15 years. I know those can be negotiated and there's some variations, but those are the entitlements or the statutes. So here's the first big problem with TIF, and that is school boards are the biggest losers, and yet they have no power. And we think that's just nuts, right? So your school districts here in Missouri, like most other states, lose the most revenue because you are the most expensive local public service. You serve the most people every day, and you're heavily reliant on the property tax that gets diverted and other taxes. And yet your school board, by state law, does not have the ability to say, no, you can't have our money. The school board loses control to the powers given to the TIF commission and the city council when the TIFs get created. We think that's just nuts. And here's another problem with the way TIF works. This is a different chart compared to the theory. And this was based on some research that was done looking at TIFs in Chicago, which is another city with way too many TIF districts. What they discovered looking at the TIF districts in the years prior to when they were designated is that the TIF district wasn't really hurting that much, right? It was actually that blue line before the red starts, the property values were going up already. It wasn't super blighted. It wasn't flat on its knees. So really what was happening here is when the TIF district gets declared at 0 years there, when the red block starts, the TIF was capturing 2 kinds of property tax increases. It was capturing the pre-existing growth that would have kept going anyway if there never had been a TIF district, and it captures the increase induced by the redevelopment activity, which is the part of the pie there on top of the blue line, between the blue and red line. So really what's happening is you have this unintended consequence where a lot of revenue that should have kept going to public services instead got captured for 23 years. In Illinois, they get renewed for another 12 in many cases. So it's actually 35 years, which is a lifetime in the life of a city. Another problem with TIF is nobody has figured out a way to do it. I've been looking at this for a very long time, to take their foot off the gas pedal. That is, we know cities are changing, right? We know the word gentrification has swept this country for the last 25 years, the back to the city movement, right? It's uneven, it varies a lot by city, but we know lots of people are getting displaced by baby boomers, empty nester baby boomers moving back to the city by millennials that want to live in the city, right? People, yes, people know what I'm talking about here. And yet there's no way in this TIF statute to reflect this change or to acknowledge that maybe we have to say, okay, enough. We've been there, we've done that. It's doing okay now. We can go spend our money some other place that's really still in need of help, right? And city policy is the same way. They don't say we're once a certain velocity of recovery kicks in, we're going to say, God bless you. Here comes the invisible hand of the marketplace working its wonders. You know, fly and have a good day. You know, you've had some reports here, like the Coffin report back in 2016. It raised all these issues. It said you're using far more TIF districts than your peer competitor city groups. You have more kinds of taxes getting diverted. That's true, right? We named 6 instead of usually 1. Most states just allow 1 tax to get diverted. At that time, there were no cost benefit studies. You just started doing them recently. There are no job creation requirements, and a lot of the projects involve things that were not just commercial or industrial. And they said you're using them in strong markets, which is exactly the opposite of what TIF is really supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about weak markets. It's probably not really causing private investment. It's not really related to job growth. These are hard, painful truths that this very big study came to, and that should have triggered an overhaul, frankly, 6 years ago. And then there's the scandals you've had, which I don't need to remind you about, but when you have a system structured like this, it can be an incentive for corruption, frankly. And that's exactly what we don't want either. And then there's the problem with the definition of blight. So like most states, Missouri says you have to declare the district blighted first. And that's sort of a term of art as it's turned out. Years ago, your affluent suburb, De Pere, basically got approached by the Australian REIT called Westfield that owned, I guess it's West something mall now, right? In De Pere, an affluent suburb. And they said, you know, we're blighted. This mall is blighted now because we don't have a Nordstrom yet. We don't have enough shoe selection. And we need to give $31 million to Nordstrom to come in so we won't be blighted anymore. And that got enacted by the city council there. And then somebody sued saying, I can't believe that's really blight. And your highest court in the state upheld it, basically saying cities can call blight anything they want. That's the problem. So the word blight is meaningless, essentially, for practical purposes. And then you had this incredibly damning study 11 years ago from your regional council of governments. It's called the East-West Gateway Council, which is the metro area planning body for both this part of Missouri and a little bit of Illinois across the river. And they said, you know, let's look back at where TIF's going. Almost all of it's going to retail, and it's all going to the outer suburbs. It's like a donut. They mapped them. They actually mapped them because they saw we had done a bunch of mapping studies. And they said, you know, at the same time, stores and big box power centers and malls are getting TIF in suburbs, we're closing stores in the city of St. Louis and in the mature older ring in inner city suburbs. We're not creating hardly any new jobs compared to the population for this. It was like a 16-year period they studied. The per job cost for these was over $370,000. And think about retail jobs, right? These are part-time, low wage, no benefits, right? These are not quality jobs. These are not generating excess tax revenues to pay for that kind of price tag. So they concluded your regional body of government, even before the Coffin study, said it's a loser. Today, we mentioned in the press release that we have some new ways of analyzing this, and especially looking at the impact, the sort of fallout, the unintended consequences of these big expenditures. And it's called the GASB Statement 77 numbers on tax abatement disclosures. GASB is called the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. It sets the rules by which governments, including most local governments, cities, counties, school districts, et cetera, keep their books, how they report their spending in their annual backward-looking audited financial reports. Okay, that's what we're talking about. This is not a projection. This is not a budget. This is what you actually did with your money, or where you didn't get your money, or where you did get your money. We actually have a database on our website now called Tax Break Tracker, where we started capturing this data because there's now 5 years of this data. It's been flowing since 2017. In our most recent study, we did a national study. We identified almost 150 school districts around the country, including some in your state, that lose more than $1,000 per student per year. That's a great deal of money for a school district, right? Thinking back to that bar chart about the spending differences here, that would flatten out some of those bar charts if that much money were not getting lost. St. Louis Public Schools, we calculated, are losing almost $1,900 per student per year, $1,865. I'm sad to tell you, but it's true. That puts St. Louis in the bottom 1%. I think you can't call it the top, right? The bottom losing 1% by revenue per student of all the school districts disclosing tax abatements in the United States and America today. And the only other district we know in this neighborhood in Missouri is Kansas City, which is just slightly higher than this, at almost $2,000 per student. This is a huge amount of money. Looked at another way, per capita, St. Louis is off the charts, right? So as of 2016, Chicago, which is the most notorious TIF city in the country by many accounts, has been for a long time, has about a ninth as many, or an eighth as many on a per capita basis TIF districts than St. Louis, right? Because Chicago's got a lot of TIF districts, but it's got 9 times more people than St. Louis does. So these are the other most populous cities in the country. Some of them don't have any. Some of them only have a few or a few dozen. You all are off the charts. St. Louis is a real outlier here. And thanks to that GASB 77 note, now we can get specific numbers per year per school district. So here's St. Louis Public Schools, 5-year trend. 5 years ago, you were losing about 10 million and change. Now you're over $35 million a year, up more than 2.5 times. And the city's losses are up at an even higher rate. The city was losing about 5 million, and now it's losing more than 22 million per year. So up more than 3 times the old rate. These are astronomical, unsustainable trends, in my opinion. I just want to emphasize that you're not alone in this, in blowing the whistle on this problem in your city. In fact, the Kansas City Public School Board has been at war on this issue for a few years with the Kansas City Public Council. They've actually been proposing legislation to curb the percent value of abatements and to curb the number of years that they can endure to help shore up the revenue and stop the red ink and curb that $2,000 per student per year loss that they're suffering. Here's what the then superintendent of Kansas City Schools said to the city council. And I'll just read it in case there's somebody on the phone that can't see the slide. He said, frankly, this is Dr. Mark Bedell said, frankly, I am exhausted with the development community pitting the city against the public entities that are doing the work of trying to give our students and their families access to the world they deserve. This is systemic racism, right? Because his majority Black and brown, 80+% school body is losing $2,000 a year. You've got nearby white majority school districts losing less than $100 per year. And we now know this because of the tax abatement disclosure data. Not to mention the fact that in some TIF districts in Kansas City have never have struggled to break even or been what we call them underwater. That is, they didn't generate enough incremental tax revenue to even pay off the bonds that had been floated to pay for the projects to begin in the first place. So when that happens, the city steps in and covers the losses, covers the difference. So instead of being a shot in the arm to the tax base, it's a drain. So just to summarize the points I'm making here, first of all, you as a city and a school district are way over dependent on property and sales taxes by any national benchmark or any state benchmark. And the taxes that you are most over dependent on get abated and diverted the most by TIF and abatements. And those losses are rising rapidly. And your foundation formula, the state's foundation formula that's supposed to help equalize these problems is Swiss cheese. The foundation formula is not working. So that's that deal on revenue. And on TIF and abatements, we're saying the city is overusing it. The city is an extreme outlier in the use of TIF. It's regionally been really bad news, sucking out retail jobs. And think about how that retail strategy played out, right? Spending $2 billion on TIF, suburban TIF, donut border TIF, right, to suck out retail jobs. And what's happening to those retail jobs today, right? They're all shutting down because of the rise of e-commerce, right? Amazon and Target and everybody and Walmart, all the big internet boys are killing the bricks and mortar retail. So all those, many of those investments in the suburban retail TIF, besides creating bad jobs at the time, are now getting severely undermined. And they, if you look at the list of plant closings and business closures, like I spent a lot of time looking at, retail is way heavily represented these days, has been for a few years. And of course, even though there's been bipartisan howling on this issue for a long time, 20 years that I'm aware of in Jefferson City, the state's not fixing the problem. So here's what I recommend. I think for anybody running for public office in this state, and especially in this city, making a concrete stand for TIF reform should be a litmus test to qualify for public office. I'm just gonna say it that bluntly. I think there should be TIF hearings in the affected neighborhoods during non-work hours, evenings or Saturday mornings or whatever, Saturday afternoons. I think all the advanced paperwork on these TIFs should be online, the way it is in some cities, ahead of time, so everybody can look at the deal and decide if they like it or whether they want to oppose it or improve it or applaud it or whatever they want to do. And I'm going to talk specifically in a minute. You need to put strings on these deals. They're called community benefits, right? And there's lots of precedents out there from other cities where you can say, we're going to make sure there's affordable housing. We're going to make sure there's local source hiring. We're going to make sure there's living wages so that we, the incumbent residents of the city, benefit from these deals. I think you should be coalescing with people in Kansas City, working on their issues in case there's an opportunity for state reform. I think you could advocate for getting the city's foot off the gas pedal and disqualifying areas that are coming back. There's such good technology out there now compared to 20 years ago about very precise measurements of the health of individual blocks in your city, very small geographic areas. It's not rocket science now. People are doing it all, marketers are doing it all the time, right? And as I'll show you in a minute, I think if somebody's taxes are not actually going to the general fund, if you live in a TIF district and a big chunk of your property taxes are going to the TIF district, I think your property tax bill should tell you that, right? Because otherwise you think you're funding public services. So let's talk about some examples from other places. In California, which started TIF and had it on the books for about 50 years, 20% of the money, all of the funds diverted in TIF in California had to go to affordable housing. It was the second largest source of funding for affordable housing in the state until it had to get taken down. And there's these things called community benefits agreements, which are project-specific agreements that often involve TIF that say you have to give first hiring preference to people in the neighborhood. They've got to get a first crack at qualifying and getting trained for the new jobs that are going to be created. They have to pay living wages. The neighborhood should have a say in what the project's going to include. Do you need a daycare center? Do you need a medical center? Do you need a better transit station service? Whatever it is. And affirmative measures about displacement. If there's going to be any housing loss, it's got to be replaced and replaced affordably. I like another TIF in Michigan. A guy named Dan Kildee was the treasurer of Genesee County, which includes Flint, Michigan. And he created a land bank because he was taking title to hundreds and hundreds of abandoned homes, tax delinquent homes that were being abandoned because people were just leaving town because of all the plant closings in Flint. And he said, okay, I'm going to create a TIF district composed of all the abandoned homes I own, right? Right now, their tax base is zero because they're off the tax rolls because I own them as county treasurer. And then he said, okay, now I can leverage that because I know they're going to go up when we fix up some of the houses and resell them. I'm going to get some property taxes when they go back on the rolls. So I can actually leverage my ownership of these properties to borrow money to fix more of them and save more of the homes instead of demolishing them. But in any case, even if I demolish them, I'm going to sell the property to the next door neighbor and it's going to go back on the tax rolls. So I can leverage that money and fix things up. I love this idea. And what could be more purely blighted than an abandoned home, right? I mean, There's nothing fishy about that definition, right? Another good project in TIF is in downstate Illinois, where they did a mixed-use transportation center based on a rail hub and a neighborhood nearby. But here's the county clerk in Cook County, Illinois, as kind of his own personal statement about TIF, said, okay, darn it, if you pay taxes to a TIF, I'm going to tell you. So here's a property tax owner, this is a real bill here, in which almost 85% of the dollars getting paid in property taxes were not going to public services. They were going to the TIF district, the Cottage and 43rd Street TIF district. I think people have a right to know. We call this truth in taxation. And here's Chicago with a hyper transparent disclosure system, so you can see all the deals. You can see all the paperwork behind the deals. You can see where the money's flowing. You can see all the outcomes over time of the deals. It's very controversial there, and I'm not saying this is a fix, but at least people have a lot more information to work with if they're trying to fix the system. I also want to emphasize to you, you're not alone among education advocates in this space. TIF has been a political issue in Chicago for at least 10 years. In fact, it's figured into the last 3 contracts between the city and the Chicago Teachers Union. And as you can see in that outset thing there, they've made a big issue of TIF and often talk about it and march about it. In Columbus, Ohio, this is a hot issue that even has figured into the last 2 school board elections, where there literally are slates of people saying, I'm gonna fix abatements if I get in office. They're costing the schools too much money. That's actually a key part of their election campaign platform, and the Columbus Education Association has been all over it. This is a big march they did on a drug company that had gotten a big subsidy deal. And in Louisiana, God bless these teachers, there's a fight with a faith-based group, a church-based group, and the 2 unions there, AFT and NEA affiliates. And the push came to shove about a really scammy tax break deal for ExxonMobil, in which the company had already built a new piece of a refinery, was already operating it for almost 2 years, and then went to the board and said, we want a tax break. We want a 10-year, 100% property tax break on something we've already built and are operating. And they went to the mat over this fight, and the teachers voted 445-6 to strike the school board if the school board didn't back out of the deal and save the school taxes from that stupid deal. And the school board hurt them and backed down. It's a big deal. It was national news. As you can see, it was in the New York Times when it happened. Fantastic organizing campaign going on down there. The other point I want to remind you about as education advocates is that you are advocating for the cornerstone of economic development. You are the business climate crusaders, and don't let anybody else convince you otherwise, right? Anybody heard about the skilled labor shortage in America, right? It's affecting every occupation, so many different places. It was even true before the Great Recession that if you read the literature, the business literature that I swim in, the availability of skilled labor was the #1 issue companies were weighing as they decided where to go, where to expand, where to relocate. And it's even more true now, and it's going to be true for the rest of our working lives, because us baby boomers are punching out by the droves right now. We've been punching out for a long time, and there's still some more of us to go, and then things are really going to get tight again. If you think about a company's decision tree process for locating in a new place, right? They're going to have to transfer people, and they're going to have to recruit people. And the first question that comes to mind when people talk to their families about moving is, how good are the schools? First question, right? And everybody in economic development knows this. So if you're underfunding your schools in the name of economic development, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot, right? You're poisoning the supply of future labor. You're making it harder to recruit companies to an area. You're hurting home values, which is another way of undermining the tax base. It's like education is the cornerstone. I'm going to close with an idea. I was really, really stunned by the news, not just about the shooting today, but also about the fact that there are 4,000 homeless students in the St. Louis public school system. So I would like to float an idea to the powers that be here, modeled on what happened in Flint, Michigan, and Genesee County, Michigan. Let's create a TIF district here in St. Louis composed of those homes that are tax delinquent homes that are owned by your redevelopment authorities, right? Especially in targeting those that are the closest to schools. Let's make a TIF district out of them and leverage the money that we'll get when we resell the homes after we fix them up, and create a TIF district devoted to rehabilitating those homes and making them available for the families of the homeless students near the schools. What could be a more pure use of TIF? And with that, I look forward to questions and answers. Thank you. Stop sharing, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Leroy, again. And now this is our question and answer session. And some of you are on live stream. We have some people inside. Remember, we have, you can ask Mr. Leroy, or you can ask, we have Alderman Peel, and then we have Senator Beck. But if you have any questions about any questions, you are able to ask. But Mr. Byron Clemens is going to not narrate, he's going to take over this question and answer session. And so we'll try to get those questions answered as much as possible.
Well, let's just go around the room. Let's start with Jay Ozier. Do you have a question for us?
Yeah, I did have.
Would you mind saying enough, Jay?
Yeah. Yes, I'm Jay Ozier and a longtime resident of the city of St. Louis and president of the St. Louis chapter of the Coalition of Black Trade Unions. This has been one thing that has irked me for some time, and I'm glad that the teachers union is flushing this out, because it's really one of the big thefts of communities in this country, and particularly here in St. Louis. We got all kind of as you illustrate, all millionaires making more millions off of us and cheating our children, our babies out of the education that they need, and is not doing anything to improve our communities. We haven't seen anything out of none of it, including the new soccer stadium up the street from where it was downtown.
If I can recap
But there was
that.
one of them that you was talking about $380,000.
Right, per job, per retail job that TIF gave.
Okay. And there, so I wanted that information.
Sure. Sure.
Because I like to use.
Local 420's got a copy of my slides. I can provide you all the backup
We'll be
information.
sharing.
Any of the sources that we used.
Did that come through? Did people hear the question? Jay's question?
Recap.
I'll just recap it briefly. Brother Ozier from the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists mentioned that from the information we got in the slides, that some of these TIFs and tax abatements were going to millionaires and projects that may be of benefit. Except, why do they take so much money from the St. Louis public schools and infrastructure? I think that's recapping what he was saying. And he referenced a specific slide with $384,000, but would you care to just elaborate a little?
Sure. And I think you're really going to the issue of inequality, right?
Right.
Which is at the heart of this too. We know now there's actually people using our data from Good Jobs First, academics using the data, as Kenny has recently reminded us, who have proven that if a place uses subsidies more, it has a higher degree of inequality. And this is kind of trickle down economics, right? Because you're giving money to companies, often multinational companies, whose shareholders don't reside in your state or much less your city, who get the benefit of the subsidies, usually unnecessary subsidies. So you really, it's a transfer of wealth from working families paying their taxes to shareholders who live all over the world. Yep.
Yeah, it's robbery.
Other questions?
I got
All right. You step up here if you like.
Yeah.
Here in St. Louis, it's kind of similar. We have something called the LRA, I think, where they own a lot of these different vacant houses and stuff all over the city. Could you give us a little more of how, in your opinion, we could use that here in St. Louis, along with our education infrastructure around these areas in order to help repopulate the city with young families?
Thank you. So the concept of land banks is not new. It's been around for 20 years now or so. And the one in Genesee County, Michigan that I mentioned was an early, very successful one, especially for the purposes of saving as much tax delinquent housing as possible. And I'd be glad to connect you with the group there in Flint that pioneered that. It's actually the person who led that is now a congressman from that area. His name is Dan Kildee. And there's a nonprofit group that he helped found called the Center for Community Progress that promotes land banks all around the country. And they've been replicated in a number of other cities, not here to my knowledge. So the idea is simple. You know, this is another example of how government has more power than it knows. We just have to remind them and nudge them to do the right thing, frankly. So if you have a redevelopment authority here with tax delinquent property, it could be targeted around your schools, as you mentioned, to help repopulate the city, and especially around areas around schools. If you have neighborhoods around schools that need help, why not use this tool to leverage TIF money against the future increase in property taxes on the properties once they get rehabilitated and reoccupied and privately owned off the tax rolls to revitalize those neighborhoods, give people a safe, short commute to school, bring housing to homeless families. You know, it's a no-brainer to me in terms of the goals and the possibility of the tool working that way.
I've got a question via text, and the question was along these lines. You know, what we're advocating here, I think I'm hearing people say, is that they're not opposed to development. And isn't it possible on the front end of these things to negotiate and say 50%, no more than 50%, 70%, no more than 10 years, and including prevailing wage and public and project labor agreements?
Yes.
That was the general. What do you think?
Sure.
Is that happening anywhere?
Yes. So the answer is yes and yes. Some states by law limit the value of property tax abatements to 50%. And they limit the duration sometimes to as little as 5 to 7 years. So that's doable right there. And as to prevailing wage, several major states have attached prevailing wages, which is to say construction wages, to economic development incentives. California, Oregon, Pennsylvania, I think Washington State as well. And then there's numerous other places that have done it on a project basis. And often the projects involve a mix of funding, sometimes public infrastructure, but then private redevelopment activity in a TIF district around a transit station or something like that. So it's absolutely doable. The normal Illinois project that I highlighted, that TIF district was absolutely prevailing wage because the building trades are very much politically active there. And then they partnered with the hotel restaurant employees union to get the permanent jobs at the hotel that was constructed to get a bargaining unit as well.
Other questions? Any on the chat? Is anybody monitoring the chat? Yeah. Do you think there is the political cultural will to redirect TIFs in the city of St. Louis? You can repeat the question.
Sure. Do I think there's a political cultural will to redirect TIFs in St. Louis? I'm not a political commentator and I don't live here. So I'm the guy from out of town that might normally have a suit on, but chose not to wear one tonight. Look, I think there's a collision course here. Either TIFs are going to get your grandma, so to speak, and they're going to continue to wreck your public goods, or you're going to fix them, because those trend lines are not sustainable. Let's put it that way. And that's why my first recommendation was TIF reform's got to be a litmus test for anybody running for public office here. That would, if I were a local activist, that would be one of the things I'd be pushing hard.
When you said grandma, Ma, is you talking about Little Red Riding Hood?
Yes, yes, that's right. Little Red Riding Hood, that's right. Mythical reference there, yes.
So I'm going to ask the questions that are in the chat, and there's quite a few.
Wow.
The first one is, if this doesn't work, why do we keep doing it?
Yeah, great question. And, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, right? And I think a lot of places are stuck in the rut and they've got one tool. And my advice to them would be, if you're in a hole, put down your shovel, you know, and turn it into a ladder, climb out of the hole. And that's where I'm coming from on recommendations. I think a lot of people in the profession have come up in an era where they're taught this is all they can do, because the state's so unhelpful and the federal government funds have shrank, although there's a lot of federal money sloshing around right now, pandemic, but they think this is the only tool in the toolkit, and they're wrong.
Who is responsible for watching out for the kids? It seems like the people who get impacted most have the least representation, the kids in public schools.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the teachers union and parents and PTAs watch out for the kids, as well as individual members of those communities. I think progressive groups here like the Missouri Budget Project certainly advocate around school funding if there's a chance in Jeff City. I think there's lots of civic activists here and groups like Still Unequal that are educating people about the systemic racial inequities in the funding outcomes here. So I think you've got a good infrastructure to build on here.
It seems like whenever the city does one of these deals, they say the school district makes more money than if they didn't. How can I say that? So what's really going on?
Yes, it's manna from heaven, we should be grateful argument. If I had a dime for every time I've heard that argument. So over time, if a project works out, it will generate more revenue. And some of that will flow to the schools. The question always is, would the project have happened anyway? And if you're in an area where there's objective evidence that the area is coming back, that previous efforts by the city to revitalize the neighborhood are succeeding, that property taxes are going up, that household incomes are going up, that blight is reducing, that abandonment is reducing, right? That home, the job creation is succeeding in the area. At what point you got to take your foot off the gas pedal, because you're giving money away that you would have gotten otherwise, and that's the tension here. That's the sophistication the city has to learn how to take on.
Can LRA use that example?
I hope so, but I confess I haven't studied its powers before coming here. I probably should take another few days before stepping out like that. But look, if they don't have the power, let's get them the power. Right?
This one is a comment, I'll say it, and then I'll go right to the question. Other cities exempt either 50% or 100% of the school district's portion of the property taxes from TIFs for developers. We have to elect alder people and mayors who agree to that. From what I'm hearing, is the way that Cortex is proposing the correct use of TIF financing?
Cortex is a very complicated subject. I mean, I've spent some time looking at it, but not a lot. So I don't have a quick, easy answer for that. And obviously, it's not one question, right? Because there's multiple parts to the project and multiple stages and tranches. But again, it looks to me like a great question of foot off the gas pedal. That is, if it's succeeding and things are working and it's already attracting private investments, is the city now able to take its foot off the gas pedal? To me, that's the big $64,000 question for a place like Cortex.
What is your opinion about Cortex?
Again, I don't have more to say than that.
Okay. So given what you said,
Yeah.
and we all know about getting no help from the state, what do you expect us to do? We're trapped in a game with unfair rules. So
sympathetically, I know that Jefferson City hasn't been helpful. And I think that's why you have to break the rules. You've got to act unpredictably. You've got to break out of the so-called prisoner's dilemma and say, we're not going to play this TIF game the way everybody else plays it. We're going to play it our way, which is to target really needy places, get our tax base strengthened back, make sure our school systems are working, use our public goods as a driver for economic development, the foundational quality of K-12 education that it rightfully holds. And that will bring a city back that's more fair, more racially just, more sustainably, financially more sustainable.
Well, you're the expert. Developers would say that TIFs and tax abatements are necessary to make their project numbers work. How would the speaker, Mr. Leroy, respond to this challenge?
So say the first part again.
Developers will say that TIFs and tax abatements are necessary to make their project numbers work.
Yeah, so that's what they always say. It's true, right? That's that, and they have to say that, right? Because there's a thing called the but-for clause. And you sign a piece of paper saying, but for the TIF, the project wouldn't happen. The trouble is, no state really gives governments the power to crawl inside the corporate black box, the decision-making secret process about rates of return, rates of profits, scenarios. Nobody gets to see that. So we're forced to take it at value. The purpose of the but-for clause, in my opinion, is to shield politicians. Because if a politician signs off on a wasteful deal and gets criticized for it, the politician can point to the developer and say, well, they signed the but-for clause. We should all be grateful. It's an honor from heaven. And that gets everybody off the hook because nobody can really test the but-for truthfulness that the developer signed.
Or Greg Leroy. Besides creating a TIF district for the district's homeless students, what would you say is the first critical step to address St. Louis' messed up tax abatement system?
I think all the things that I outlined before, that is hyper disclosure, restricted targeting. There should be parts of the city now that are clearly just designated as doing okay and don't qualify anymore for those kinds of help. It should be restricted to those parts of the city where it's clear things have not turned around yet, where there's still redlining, where there's still discrimination, where there's still pollution, where there's places that really still need a shot in the arm, so to speak. I think that's first. I think affordable housing, in addition to homeless housing, is a crisis in almost every city, and you all should get ahead of that and be proactive about using like 20%, like California did, for TIF. I mean, for affordable housing, 20% share of all TIF revenues. That would be a great shot in the arm for that kind of purpose. And then all the community benefits, again, the local hiring, the living wages. There's lots of models we can show you and lots of other nonprofit groups practicing these things in other cities. These are established practices.
Has any organization done any analysis of the wealth redistribution from the lowest economic to the highest via TIFs and tax abatement?
I don't think I've seen anybody try to really kind of run the math exactly that way. But I mentioned before, there are academic studies showing a clear correlation between places that use subsidies the most and have the highest degrees of inequality. I think the other source I would recommend for people is a group called the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org, which has done great work on the rising inequality of both income and wealth in the United States, including the racial dynamics, especially of wealth distribution. Yeah.
Oh, they are coming in.
Good.
Ooh, okay. I hear you, but do they have a second TIF or such a large second TIF?
I'm not sure who
That was a
they,
little
they're
earlier.
referring to.
That was a little earlier. I have it.
Okay.
Could you all come back to that for me, so I can come back to that in the chat? Thanks. When talking about worker requirements in the construction crafts and building, these buildings with tax abatement or TIFs, is there a recommended way to prevent checkerboarding?
We need a definition of checkerboarding. That's a new one on me.
Ms. Aurora, can you put what checkerboarding is for us, please, and we'll come back to that? Okay, can you explain more clearly how money is taken away from our students?
Sure. So going back to that pie chart I had about where money comes from for the St. Louis School District, 76%, more than 3/4 of it comes from local property and sales taxes. And those are the two biggest kinds of property, kinds of revenue that get diverted by TIF, along in the case of the city budget with the earnings tax. So 76% of the school budget is right on the front line, right in the crosshairs of where TIF takes money from.
Checkerboarding, for those that don't know, is the action of moving city residents or minorities from job site to job site to hit the requirements on the job for minority participation. What bill should be put forth first to the mayor and board of aldermen? Something that will build the base of understanding and support for reform.
I think we could take parts of what I've laid out tonight as kind of the findings, right? Some bills have kind of like preambles saying whereas such and such is true and whereas such and such is true, therefore we got to do such and such to fix the problem. I think you could take about 8 of the things that I pointed out tonight as your whereases, and then the solutions would be things that we can help draft language with. We've got model language on our website. We can talk about very specific remedies. Disclosure at the top, community benefits, job creation requirements, foot off the gas pedal. The foot off the gas pedal will have to be creative because I can't point to a good example of that in practice yet. But you all are a screaming, howling case study for the need for foot off the gas pedal. We would spend the energy to help.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So, Mr. Leroy, I would like to know what cities are using tax incentives well, and how do you define, that success?
Sure.
And how can we, as St. Louis, replicate good use of tax incentives? Because it's not all bad.
Right.
They are here for a reason, to help grow cities.
Right.
And so we should be using them. I'd like to know,
Sure.
where do we have the
Great
best
question.
examples?
Great, and thank you for that, Alderman Field, because you didn't hear me say get rid of TIF, right? Nobody said the word abolition was not spoken tonight, right? So, and that's not where we've ever come from. We're saying fix the system, take it back to its roots, take it back to its original intentions before it's strayed so far away. So I can't point to one city that I think has it all figured out. I can point to several places that have good things figured out. So for example, Los Angeles has community benefits agreements figured out. Every redevelopment project that goes through the redevelopment board has living wages, local hiring, affordable housing, kinds of set aside. You can't get through there without it. That's been a long organizing project with local activists, but it's the political reality. San Antonio, rare among big cities in the United States, when Amazon HQ2 ran that crazy auction for their second headquarters, the mayor and the county judge basically wrote a fascinating letter to Jeff Bezos saying, we know you're jacking us around. There's a lot of kissy, lovey language with Amazon, but basically said, we know you're jacking us around and we have better things to do with the money. But come here and let us show you what we're doing with education and quality of life and infrastructure and, clean air and water and all that kind of stuff. And I really tip my hat to them for that. Certainly in Denver and Dayton, we have long-standing 30-year-old experiments in which all of the jurisdictions talk to each other and actively cooperate and will never raid each other. So someone today was saying that a typical suburban TIF deal consists of one suburb stealing a Walmart from another suburb. In Denver and Dayton, that doesn't happen. It's not illegal, but because of this long-standing cooperative structure that the cities have with each other, they just don't do stupid stuff like that.
And we know that regionalism is important, right? And that's partially what that is doing, right? In terms of what Denver and Dayton are doing, is that we need to have regional cooperation. And that makes
both regions grow and better and stronger.
Right.
So that is a really great example and something that we are looking to do here in St. Louis County, and that we can be, you know, a better city, county together as we work on this, so that we aren't taking from one, you know, robbing Peter from Paul, because that's really what's happening.
Right, right.
And it doesn't help anybody.
And look, this isn't just a kumbaya speech about regionalism, right? Think about the real world, right? Who in this region lives, shops, works, worships, recreates, and studies all in the same jurisdiction? Nobody, right? Probably, right? Lots of people cross lots of jurisdictions every day, and that's why. Kenny?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that.
Let me ask the question here.
Okay. Yeah, I would just wanted to ask, sort of following up on something you had said, and something Alder person Field said. Would it be good to, like, but say with Chip, make you know, binding objective measures of deprivation be a criterion for whether you can use TIF at all? Because that would seem to me that, you know, if it's a place that's definitely deprived, it definitely needs investment. You don't even need it by court test anymore. And you satisfy the question of you know, life. You know, you don't need to worry about, are these buildings 30 or 36 years old, or all those crazy subjective measures of life.
Right. So I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't studied home rule powers in Missouri, but in most states, you know, it's clear, as you see in the things I'm ticking off here, these examples, that there's state law which generally acts as a floor rather than a ceiling, right? And if a local government wants to add more conditions, like a more rigorous definition of blight or deprivation, it can. In the same way, it can add living wages, local hiring, prevailing wages, et cetera, right? It's the same issue.
How powerful is a retaliation from developers who don't get these tax breaks typically? Are we seeing any cities with any particular issue on this currently as TIF reform gets more popular? Retaliation.
Oh, you mean like developers blacklisting a city because it's tightening up its TIF ship?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. I mean, look, I think abusive TIF is just a measure of political domination of a city by developers. I'm not saying anything profound. There's lots of academic evidence of that. There was a great study, a great reporting sequence done by the NPR station in Washington, D.C. years ago called Deals for Developers. And they said, let's look at the 10 biggest donors to the campaigns of the city council members. And then let's look at the 10 biggest recipients of corporate welfare, so to speak. And they were the same people, they're the same developers. So, you know, this is an endemic problem. So obviously campaign finance reform may figure in to some of this as well, because we have to make sure that elected officials are responsive to taxpayers, not just donors.
We got a clarification.
Sure.
Isn't this Cortex's second request for a TIF? Is this unusual for corporations to go back and ask for a TIF a second time?
I'm not know how to answer that.
It is, they're coming back to renew the TIF.
Okay.
And the second part of the question is one you could answer, I guess. Is that unusual?
It's not common. There certainly are some big projects that have tranches or phases, like a big one in Baltimore that's struggling right now. So in big TIF projects, you see that sometimes, yes.
Around 5 years ago, I heard the SLDC had no data infrastructure to track what happens with tax abated properties. So there's no way to calculate the economic impact of the development. Is this accurate?
So my understanding, and it was nailed down in the Kaufman report, was that until recently, there were no cost benefit studies. And again, this is not unusual, although many places do studies that I find lacking in rigor, but at least they run some numbers to try to assure themselves that it's not a loser, a fiscal loser, a financial loser. So that's also got to be part of the process here. I mean, it's another way to help set bars to prevent overspending.
That is all for me.
Thank you.
Senator Beck, please.
I want to add something to your conversation.
Please.
And I know you mentioned that we don't have a definition for blight,
Right.
but we did. We put one in 2021.
Right.
In the state legislature that spelled out blight pretty well.
Right.
And I think it may change as we go forward. And if you want, I can read it.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've heard it yet or.
I didn't see that.
Okay, so it was effective August 28, 2021. And Senator Washington worked on this, and I worked on it with some TI stuff. But a blighted area is an area which, by reason of the predominance of insanitary or unsafe conditions, deterioration of site improvements, or the existence of conditions which endanger life or property by fire or other causes, or any combination of such factors, retards the provision of the housing. I don't have glasses on.
Yeah.
Provision of housing accommodations or constitutes an economic or social liability or menace to public health, safety, or welfare in the present condition and use. So it is pretty solid definition of site.
I beg to differ. I beg to differ. So here, that language echoes language in quite a few other states. And it actually dates back to the Progressive era. This was language first written about 100 years ago for the first slum and blight clearances during the Progressive era of the United States. And it sounds good, and who could be against those things you just named? The trouble is there's no specific metrics. That is, it's like a grab bag of variables, and anybody can say, okay, I can check boxes 2 and 12, and therefore I'm good to go. And it's easy to qualify any place with a broad set of definitions that don't have numbers or quantitative metrics attached to them that way. So that's
So
the challenge.
cost benefit analysis is in the right direction.
Cost
It's a
benefit-
start.
Yeah, but I also think, look, you can do metrics like no more than 2% of the city's tax base gets abated or reverted. I don't know what the number is right now, but I like that number as a safeguard, for example. You could say we're only going to have, we're only going to have 40 TIF districts instead of 120. You could say we're going to let the other ones run out, right? You could say we're going to restrict TIFs to the poorest, 100 census tracts in the city. You could do lots of very specific numeric benchmark things with this money and make the city be disciplined about it. That's the point.
We have
Please.
a comment from Cortex.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, this is Natalie from Cortex. Here, just a point of clarification. We are not asking for an extension. We are asking for an activation of one of our RPAs.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie, for that clarification. Go ahead.
We've had our last question, CJ.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Before Albert comes and takes us home, I want to remind people of we are teachers. And as teachers, we got some homework for you. We always want to do our homework. We have a book here. It's called Mapping Decline. If you just do a search, Mapping Decline, by Colin Gordon, St. Louis and the Fate of the American City. Once a thriving metropolis on the banks of Mississippi, St. Louis, Missouri is now a ghostly landscape of vacant houses, boarded up storefronts, and abandoned factories. The Gateway City is by any measure one of the most depopulated, de-industrialized, and deeply segregated examples of American urban decay. This is your homework. Get a copy of this. It's at the library. It's on ebook. And you can get a kind of a flavor of what the plans have been over the last year. We couldn't control the circumstances of today, but we still pressed on because our distinguished guest came in from out of town. And I'm going to say to you I'm sure we wet your whistle. We just wet your whistle on this topic. And Greg, if you would honor us and come back at another date where we can meet in person and do all of this together. But before Albert comes up, I think it's appropriate to have another moment of silence for our student and our sister Barbara, whose life expired. Okay, Albert, come on, take us home, brother.
On that note, I do have a from local from our national office, 420 office. Our president Weingarten said, first and foremost, we grieve the deaths of the victims of this tragic school shooting and pray for those who are injured. And we thank the first responders for their quick and fearless action, saving countless others. As more details emerge about today's tragedy, the simple truth remains. The epidemic of gun violence in our community is a public health risk to all of us. Schools should be one of the places where students, teachers, and entire educational community feel safe. Yet today, another school has been ravaged by senseless violence. The time to talk about stronger common sense gun safety measures, including a ban on weapons of war, as well as mental health support, is right now, while we grieve this horrific loss with the Central VPA community. And another thing, we'd like to thank all our visitors for coming, for helping us talk about TIFs. Like President Cummings and President Weingarten said, you know, St. Louis is in mourning, not just Central VPA, not just the families, the whole St. Louis community, and all the schools and staff. We're still processing ourselves. We're still processing as we go. When we walk into the building tomorrow, what are we going to do? So I think it's important that we keep all of us in our prayers, and that's it. I mean, keep everybody in St. Louis, but also as teachers, our kids, our families in your prayers. And, you know, the last plug for 420, but it's not a plug, but it's true. We have a counseling program. It's to all local 420 members. It's on the website. It's on Facebook right now. It's on the website. It's called a trauma counseling program, and it's for all local 420 members and families. So take advantage of that. We don't have to be we want to be strong, but you got to take care of yourself as well. And again, thanks for today, and thank you all for coming.
What happened if you don't get your blessing? I said, well, you didn't like that. And it did already work this out behind the scenes. So you were just the sunshine because of the property and all that. The shield itself, and make it. Actually, it was like one of the highest. The area was small.